Our next speaker is Dr. Raef Zreik from Carmel Academic Center in Tel Aviv University, who will speak about Kant on autonomy, the problem or the solution.
Can I speak from here?
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Professor Waldron was my teacher at Columbia University.
Many years ago.
1,000 years ago. And I owe him lots of my ideas. Actually, my paper, you will find it pretty much connects to Professor Waldron's paper. It's if Professor Waldron's paper is accommodating in a way or reaching a happy end, mine is a little bit more tragic in the sense if Professor Waldron trying to solve a problem, I'm trying to look at historically this moment of the chasm between our conception of morality as an objective morality and our focus on a subjective will to have a right in the sense of subjective will. And I took Immanuel Kant as for this purpose. Now, Kant is very interesting. One can't focus on subjective right very easily if one doesn't have an objective, a theory of objective morality. If you're Hume or Hobbes, it's easy to focus on subjective right. It's more difficult when you're like Kant, you have a very clear theory of objective morality. And to focus on subjective right is much more difficult. You can focus on objective right if you don't have a theory of subjectivity or subjective right. If you're extremely believing in a sort of real theory of morality or only in the Ten Commandments and you know what they are asking from you, then you can believe in objective morality. The questions becomes much more complicated with someone like Immanuel Kant, who believes in the separation in the having subjective right, not because we don't know what's the right thing to do. He clearly knows what's the right things to do and insists on subjective right. So that's why I think this split in early 19th century, and if there's enough time, I would try to trace it through Savini and from Savini to Austin to the will theory in the continent. And in the common law, that becomes the moment of crisis that, in a way, the lecture that we've heard is one way to overcome this chasm. So allow me to read, because I wanted to be precise in matters of time. Responsibility, or the ability to respond, to hear the calling and react, assume the ability to act. However, it doesn't connote mere action taken on a whim or out of desire, but rather an action that lies within the bounds of reason and reflects a sound judgment. The responsible person, in this sense, is free and constrained at the same time. It's impossible to come up with a definition of responsibility that doesn't begin with the presumption of freedom. A society that lacks the concept of freedom must also lack the concept of responsibility. Responsibility assumes free choice. On the other hand, a morality that categorically privileges personal will and choice, neoliberalism if you want, that puts the idea of a mere choosing self at the center regardless of the matter of the choice itself or of its content, might also lack the concept of responsibility. In this way, the concept of responsibility plays the role of a mediating category between two poles. On the one end sits objective right as an adjective in the sense of doing the right thing, and on the other sits the idea of having a right, a subjective concept based on the individual will as a mere choice. This is the story that Richard Tuck tells. If one collapses, one of the two poles, then responsibility collapses with it because it's the bridge that connects actually these two corners. Probably it was Grotius who first articulated a debate that was taking place in his time and that continued long after him between voluntarists and intellectualists. This is a theologian debate that I don't want to delve into, but this is the origin of the debate. Starts as a debate about God, not about human, and then it's immigrated. It began as a debate between theologians and later developed into one within moral and legal philosophy. But Grotius lent this debate refined articulation by distinguishing between two concepts of the word right, one as a noun and one as an adjective. Right as a noun is something one may have or own, as in the phrase, I have a right. This is the subjective sense of a right, and it appears at the same time that we witness the rise of the subject and subjectivity in general, coinciding with the slow demise of objective moral values. Probably Hobbes, after Grotius, would be the main figure in this tradition, but there were many before and after. On the other hand, we have the concept of right as an adjective in the sense of doing the right thing. And the idea of doing the right thing, and this is a long story, assumes a conceptual universe in which rights and uses actually haven't yet been separated yet. But can we develop a moral theory that takes seriously subjectivity, that is subject-centered, and at the same time claims to be objective and universal? Or are we faced with the predicament of choosing between objective morality without freedom or subjective right, or choosing the other way around? This was the task facing Kant, who wanted to achieve an impossible mission. He wanted a subject-centered morality that is not out there in society or in religion, with the freedom as its organizing principle, revolving around the human subject who is able to orient himself morally and independently, while at the same time aspiring to an objective, categorical, and universal morality, one that is neither contingent nor empirical. Unsurprisingly, this heroic attempt yielded his invention of the concept of autonomy, a combination of auto, a self, and nomos, a law. The meaning of autonomy is that the self legislates and abides by the same moral law that is mandated by practical reason. The self is the author and the subject, the servant of the law. Thus, the tension that's inhabited the space between two opposing camps in the history of thought becomes a tension within Kant's theory himself. As I will show, Kant gave us one of the best articulation of universal objective morality in his moral theory. This is early Kant of the groundwork and practical reason. And yet, he gave us probably one of the best arguments for establishing of the separate domain of juridical right as a site of subjective and arbitrary will with discretion and freedom to act morally. This is what's interesting about Kant, because probably one can find the arsenal of argument for objective morality and for subjective will, arbitrary will, at the same time. This is the late Kant of the metaphysics of moral religion within the limits of reason. It is this difference between the two Kants, the early one and the late one, the moral and the legal Kant, the objective and the subjective, that is of most interest to me here. And is this shuttle between early Kant and late Kant and the nature between the two conceptions of freedom and the two conceptions of autonomy between the early and the late. And what remains from early Kant if we read late Kant seriously? I mean, if we take both of them seriously? Early Kant develops a theory of morality that is based on the concept of autonomy. Here the concept of autonomy is a positive one, and accordingly he has a positive concept of freedom that correlates with it. Autonomy here doesn't mean only that the self is free of external factors and influences, but also that the self is free of its inclination and desires. But if it is free of both external and internal inclination, then how is it to decide and according to what? The Kantian answer is according to the moral law that reason, as an autonomous activity, can yield. The categorical imperative is that procedure through which we can orient ourselves morally without any empirical, material, or consequentialist help. For this early Kant, freedom doesn't mean merely the freedom to choose, but rather to make the right choice. In this sense, to act morally and to act autonomously and to act freely and rationally are in fact one and the same, as if the objectivity of the demand of the moral law converges with the subjectivity of our will. This early Kantian moral philosophy attempts to save morality from skeptics and subjectivists like Hume and Hobbes, while at the same time trying to preserve it as subject-centered morality. Now, clearly, what remains of the will, human will, in this picture is questionable. Late Kant develops another concept of autonomy, freedom, and will. This is the account of the concept of right as a juridical. The legal theorist, here Kant becomes legal theorist of choice and negative freedom, and this one that I wish to turn to now. This is the Kant who has been appropriated actually by many legal theorists, and actually it becomes the pillar of legal theory in the 19th century, and we're witnessing a revival of this concept of legal right, Kantian legal right, by many new Kantian like Ripstein and Weinreb and others, and it could be a cornerstone appropriated by many neoliberals because it puts choice and preference at the center of not only legal theory, but it devours the whole moral scheme. The problem with early Kant is that he presents us with two opposing poles. We are either in the grip of nature, inclination, and desire, and as such unfree, and we are heteronomous, or we overcome external and internal factors, eliminate both external coercion and internal inclination, and become fully autonomous, free in the positive sense. What is left out of this conceptual scheme is the possibility of acting freely and immorally at the same time, acting without external pressures or coercion, but subject to our inclination and desire. That is, free to be immoral sometimes, or free to do wrong. It is this third space, the space of mere choice, of being free to act in arbitrary manner, that is the focus of late Kant. The focus here is on becoming a choosing subject that is free of external factors of coercion from others, regardless of the moral correctness or wisdom of our choice. If I decide not to rent my apartment to someone who really needs it, actually, I do wrong to him and to myself, to his happiness and to my happiness. But to have a right, in this Kantian sense, is exactly this, that I'm entitled to be a little bit vicious and stupid because I'm hurting myself as well. The question that I will return to, and probably the focus, is what of early Kant remains in late Kant? And there are many answers to this question. One easy answer is that these are completely two separate domains, and I think that Professor Waldron's lecture is, in a way, he didn't speak about Kant, saying they couldn't be exactly fully two domains. I want to explicate a little bit about the way Kant makes this distinction. After Kant has established morality as autonomous domain, separated from happiness, he endeavors in the metaphysics of moral to establish the juridical domain itself as autonomous domain that stands alone, separated even from morality. At the heart of this project lies the mission to locate those duties that are duties of right, duties that can be enforced by law, by the public authority through coercion. Kant doesn't think that we can use the legal system to enforce all our moral duties. It is a demand of morality itself that certain duties are not to be enforced. Morality has to learn to discipline itself and to put limits on itself in order to leave some space free for agents to be moral. Morality doesn't not impose itself, as to say, all the way down. Remember, the Kantian morality has in itself subjective morality part of it, so it can't be all the way down morality. The way in which Kant establishes the domain of right, the legal domain, is really complicated. Here I wish to make a few comments in this regard that could be related to our discussion. The first concerns the separation between actions and the incentives behind the actions. The juridical is interested in the external aspect of the act, irrespective of the reasons and the incentives for it. In ethics, we have to conform to moral rules for the right reason, but in the juridical, we only have to conform, to make according to the form, regardless why we're doing this. The second point is that while the juridical rules that establish the domain of right, the juridical, might have originally been mandated by moral reasons are supposed to stand alone once they are determined. There are moral reasons why we should keep promises, but when we make the law of contract, it stands on its own. To establish the autonomy of law, we must sever it from mother morality. If it continues to be dependent on the reasons for the rules, then it will lose its independence as an autonomous domain. Its knowability, predictability, and administratability would be threatened. This looks like much the ladder in Wittgenstein philosophy. Once we reach the roof, we can dispose of the ladder. Both these moves from morality, takes from morality only its form, and from the act only its external aspect. They allowed law to be clear and administrable, a site of consensus that could therefore be public and enforceable. For the same reason, duties of right are perfect and narrow. Okay. A third point of critical importance relates to the role of right in the Kantian system, and this is something that I want to spend one moment. While duties of right are moral duties, and this is questionable in literature, I mean, this is my reading, that duties of right are moral duties, not ethical duties. While duties of right are moral duties, that morality would require us to fulfill, the role of right in the subjective sense is not to make us moral. Law is supposed to create a space for us that only allows us to be moral, but doesn't force us to be moral. Here, law, the domain of right, the juridical, plays a very complicated role vis-a-vis morality. It fulfills some of what morality requires, but at the same time, it puts limits on morality's colonial aspiration to dominate all aspects of life. Law acts as a site of resistance to morality by securing a space for the self where it can act on whim, caprice, in arbitrary way. This is a liberated space, one that law liberates from morality itself in order to fulfill the demands of morality. So it starts to sound like Hegelian. Some would kill me for this. The concept of this right in this regard becomes the space in which we can bracket the question of ends, whatever those ends might be, either ends of morality or ends of happiness. Right are focused on the means only, not ends. They establish us as agents, as a choosing selves. Here, autonomy bears a new meaning. Autonomy in a merely negative sense, whereby the self is free of external coercion and free to make its own choices clearly. However, it can make arbitrary choices. By bracketing ends, I mean that to have a right in this scheme would require that there should be a space where the self is allowed some arbitrary margin within which it can operate immorally and unwisely. In this sense, to have a right means to demand and claim space in which one can be vicious and unwise. I want to finish by I have several quotations here. This moment is very interesting in the early 19th century. Savini, who was, in his overall view, was historicist influenced by Hegel, he appropriates the Kantian concept of right, but he doesn't adopt Kantian morality. And he develops the will theory, and he gives this definition of right as the sovereign that rules within his territory in an absolute manner. I mean, he uses the terminology of a prince that rules within his territory. This would become pretty much the image and the cornerstone of legal theory through the concept of will theory. In private law, property. The image is property. To have a property is to have a domain where I am the full sovereign. But imagine property not physically, but as a territory that I have right. Now, the interesting thing that this late Kantian concept of right as a site of arbitrariness through the will theory stands on its own in the 19th century. In what sense? Kant reaches his concept from his moral theory, but you can reach the same concept without having the metaphysical gloss of the Kantian moral philosophy. If you're a utilitarian, utilitarianism can live very well with the will theory, because the will theory can actually function very well with utilitarianism, because everybody knows what is best for him. Then we should assign to each person a certain domain where he should decide for himself. In this sense, this is the moment that legal theory actually becomes in the foreground and leaves, in a way, all the rest: moral philosophy, historicism, utilitarianism, Kantian deontology, and they all converge on the will theory. But can this project succeed, actually? This needs separation. First of all, can it analytically succeed in terms of neatness? Can it give up the idea of whatever its mother or parenthood was, utilitarianism, deontology, or historicism? The second, it's a normative questions. Do we want to live in a universe where the concept of arbitrary choice, subjective right, can exhaust all of the moral universe that we live in? So we have analytical problem and we have a normative question. I'll stop here.
Good.